good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on where in the world you are. My name is Sally Hardy. I'm the Chief Executive of the Regional Studies Association. I'd like to welcome you to this Regions in Recovery 22. It's the second edition of our global e-festival, caused, of course, by the need to pivot all meetings from face-to-face to virtual. So I welcome you to this meeting and I formally open it. I can share with you that the Regional Studies Association is navigating its way out of COVID-induced restrictions, and we will move back to face-to-face meetings in the autumn. We kick off with our Central and East European conference in September. In November, we work with the DG Regio of the European Commission and also the government of Croatia when we co-host the Cohesion Policy Conference in Zagreb. And then in November, we return with our winter conference in London at the end of November, and we're all greatly looking forward to that. I'd like to thank my colleagues that have helped to set up this festival, this two-week festival, particularly John Harrison, who is not only an editor on regional studies, but also the conference coordinator for the RSA's board. But then my colleagues, and in particular, Katarina Berger, Alex Holmes, Lisa Reynolds, and Daniela Carl. Now, before I hand over to Alec, our chair, I just thought I'd share with you some of the stats for the conference. So we're working with 15 partners. There will be 70 sessions and 6 plenary sessions over the next 2 weeks. There's more than 200 papers going to be presented. Over 400 participants at the moment. That number will grow greatly each day as we go through the festival. This year, more participants are participating from emerging economies, and that's particularly pleasing. A very slight dip in the number of students and early career researchers that have so far signed up, but of course we'll see what happens in a fortnight's time. Roughly parity between men and women signing up to participate in the conference, and about 50-50 between members and non-members. You will recall that we've made the conference free for everybody to participate in as a way of opening the doors and being inclusive and welcoming through what's been a very difficult period of time. And on that cheery note, I will gladly hand to Alec Murphy, our chair for today's session. Over to you, Alec, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Sally, and welcome everyone. My name is Alec Murphy. I'm a longtime member of the geography faculty at the University of Oregon with a specialty in political geography. And so this Regions in Recovery conference is very interesting, I think, to a broad range of disciplines, and really will be an exciting interchange between scholars with different backgrounds. Just the usual rules, of course, that I'm sure we're all unfortunately too familiar with when it comes to dealing with these Zoom conferences, but please keep muted at all times unless you're called upon to speak. And of course, the session will be recorded. So if you don't want to be seen, just turn off your video and your audio. In any case, we're going to open the conference this morning with this opening plenary panel that could not be more timely. The title is the Russia-China Interface, One Border, Two Regions. And we have two extraordinary speakers who are going to each go back and forth with some comments over the next hour. And then we'll have about a half an hour for questions and comments. And our two speakers are Franck Billé from the University of California, Berkeley. Franck is a cultural anthropologist / geographer who's based at Berkeley. And he's the program director of the Tang Center for Silk Road Studies. He's well known as the author of a book called Sinophobia that was published by the University of Hawaii Press in 2015. He's working on a book for Duke University Press on somatic states, on cartography, geobodies, bodily integrity. Our other speaker is Caroline Humphrey, who got her PhD from the University of Cambridge, anthropology, has spent most of her career at Cambridge. She has worked in Russia and Mongolia and China, as well as India, Nepal, Ukraine, on Soviet and post-Soviet provincial economy and society, on inequality questions, on urban transformations in post-socialist cities. She founded the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies unit at Cambridge, and she's currently director of that unit. So without further delay, I will turn things over to our two speakers now. We're going to start with Franck. Franck, take it away.
Thank you, Alec, for these kind words. And thank you for the conference organizers to invite us, especially Klaus Doves reached out to us at first to ask us to do this keynote. So we'll be talking about the recent book that we've published on the border between Russia and China. And when we started doing research about this border, we quickly found that there was very little literature about it. Most of the scholarly work on Russia focuses on the Western region, and similarly, research on China tends to focus on the heartland. When there is research about minority regions or the peripheries, these two sets of literature are largely circumscribed within the Eastern European for Russia and Asian bodies, and Asian for China, bodies of knowledge, respectively. The vast region that is bisected by the border is peripheral to both. And there is only a handful of scholars who work across these disciplinary, political, and geographical divides. To an extent, this is due to practical reasons, because it requires the study of two very different languages. But there is also a pervasive feeling that the two countries belong to different regions, to different scholarly zones of expertise. This sentiment is one that is also present on the ground and echoed in the interviews and conversations we had with borderlanders on both sides of the border. Despite living at the interface of two major countries, with the potential commercial and cultural exchanges this represents, the border is seen as a fracture, as a fault line. This difficulty of researching Northeast Asia as a single region is compounded by the dichotomous nature of the Russia-China border. In most of the world's borders, the border cuts across a cultural continuum. Even in heavily surveilled borders, like the US-Mexico one, for instance, one finds numerous historical, cultural, and kinship ties. This is not the case on this border, populated largely after the creation of the border. There are indigenous populations living in the region, a substratum we shall discuss later, but mostly it is inhabited by Russians and Chinese who have moved or have been moved there to that region from elsewhere. Western Russia and Ukraine, in the case of Russia, Shandong and other northern provinces in the case of China. When the border was reopened in the late 1980s, after more than 2 decades of hermetic closure, accompanied by relentless propaganda, the populations on the two sides found they hardly knew anything about each other. They couldn't speak each other's languages, and the very few familial ties that had been woven across the border were completely cut. This history creates a highly dichotomous and bipolar environment where stepping over the border feels like crossing from one world into another. As we discussed in the first part of the talk, the fact that the political space is construed very differently by China and Russia further contributes to making the border a line of fracture rather than a line of engagement. And this creates additional hurdles for researchers. Yet, and this is the crux of the theoretical contribution we seek to make in this talk, a focus on a political geography aligned solely on a Westphalian cartography misses part of the story. While this is the view we are accustomed to, we suggest the boundary line is supplemented by cultural and affective space, which we gloss as auratic, from aura. There is an auratic sociality, which we discuss in the second section of the lecture. And then there are auratic geographies, which may take the form of buffers, backyards, or phantoms, discussed in the third section. These can help account for geopolitical shifts and engagements. We suggest in particular that the mobilization of these concepts can be fruitful for the literature on regions and also to unpack current Russian claims regarding Ukraine. Caroline?
Could we have the next slide, please? The sensation that one is standing on the edge of a country is remarkably different in Russia from in China. And this is because the two states have created utterly incongruent administrative and infrastructural systems. These have been built up over centuries and assaulted into people's accustomed practices and their assumptions about the way things should be. Now, it's true that observers have drawn attention to what these two great powers have in common currently, namely political centralization, authoritarian government, rapacious capitalism, multi-ethnicity, and the problem of control of the peripheries. But it's also true that that generalization obscures the fact that each of these features can be variously understood, and they can be acted upon in different ways. The divergence between Chinese and Russian aims and methods has become particularly apparent in the 21st century, and the border makes them starkly visible. The routes and communication networks by which the periphery is linked to the respective metropolitan centers form increasingly dissimilar and differently weighted patterns. So what are these disparate spatial arrangements, and how did they come to be? There's a maverick but very insightful Russian geographer called Boris Rodoman, who argued that Russia is an administrative territorial monster, that's his term, that creates a special kind of vacant space at borders. And what he had in mind was Russia's historical hyper-centralized hierarchy of government with its associated radial infrastructure. This was first established during the reign of Catherine I in the 18th century, and then became standard throughout the country. It went on being reproduced right up to the present day, even though it became kind of out of sync with population movements and new centers of industry. There must be a vital motif that renews itself, Rodoman wrote, that's written into the land like a matrix. But what is this? His answer is that the pyramid of subordinated places encapsulated within one another springs from the anisotropic character of Russian society. Now, in physics, an isotropic object is one that has different properties in different directions. If we take an example of wood, that's stronger along the grain than across it. So such an object can be tough in one aspect, but is apt to break up when approached from a different angle. The anisotropic aspect of Russian society is that its vertical links are very strong and its horizontal ones are weak. And this is manifest in the administrative structure and in fact in the entire socio-cultural landscape. The vertical power relationships are reflected in radial roads that link the metropolis to the regional capitals, and from there to provincial centers, to district centers, and finally to villages on the periphery. So the drive comes from the center to capture more resources on a linear trajectory in which, as they see it, what's in front is a kind of open wilderness, conceptually lower and ready for the taking. Now, if you take the point of view of people living on the periphery, in that kind of system, the center is what matters. The only roads kept in good shape are those roads leading upward to the bosses. And meanwhile, the roads running horizontally between small towns or villages are neglected, or they become impassable in bad weather, or they simply don't exist. And it's similar for bus services, mobile phone signals, and so on. They fan out from Moscow and from provincial centers, but they become more exiguous and may give out altogether at the edge of the jurisdiction. So the monstrous aspect of this is that it creates remoteness in the gaps between the skeletal radial lines. And so it's in these peripheries that the open spaces involved are the most stretched out and the minor roads most likely to peter out. And this reflects greatly on this border area of China, which is, after all, the ultimate periphery and consists of a closed zone, an securitized exclusion zone, which is a kind of emptiness, a wide strip all the way along the border that nobody may enter without permission. One thing we suggest in this paper is that this Russian spatial organization can be seen as forming a decisionist landscape, as distinct from a processual one. Decisions are made in the hierarchical center, for example, to locate a mine here or a processing plant or a town in some place, and then a radial spur of the infrastructure is built to enable that decision to be carried out. Now, in the case of Northeast China, a very different geography swings into view. That in our area of a vast river basin opening to the sea and encompassing both sides of the border. The physical reality is subject to a powerful representational structure, which is very, very different from that found north of the border. So if the Russian idea of the Far East is based on its own history of abrupt west to east military advances out of Moscow, subduing territories and indigenous peoples in kind of linear moves until the Pacific, the Chinese one is not linear, but a series of concentric circles expanding outward from an inland central zone. The Japanese historian Takeshi Hamashita has provided a very good analysis of this Chinese vision, which I think we could characterize as processional rather than decisionist. Hamashita wrote, challenging Eurocentric history, this is a space, the Chinese space, that combines a landed and a maritime world. The seas and the land should be understood as part of a larger whole in which the land is part of the seas and vice versa. The sea forms the basis for communication and network flows, not a barrier. End of quote. So the major principle that brought this kind of far-flung and disparate world into a kind of unity was the system of trade and tribute that functioned in China from the Tang dynasty to the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911. And this was a conception of hierarchical order sustained by the Confucian rule of virtue in the person of the emperor. Backed by military force, it nevertheless allowed subordinate realms such as Korea, Japan, Laos, or Vietnam to assert themselves as centers, in inverted commas, centers vis-a-vis the smaller states under their sway. And tributary states sent periodic tribute missions to the Chinese capital. Now that Chinese land-sea orbit included settlements in lands that are now parts of Russia. And the current major Russian towns in the Russian Far East all had earlier Chinese names. For example, Vladivostok was called Haishenwei, which means sea cucumber cliffs, and it was reached by boat. Now today, China's ancient sea-embracing vision is being brought to the fore again with its installations in the South China Sea, as our discussion later will touch upon. China's vision of itself shifted temporarily with the conquest of the Mongols and the Manchus, but at no point did it involve a single definite border. Rather, it consisted of a cultural core in central China, ringed by an expanding series of nested realms, gradually incorporating land on the margins via the signification of surrounding barbarian groups. And the line between self and other lacked clarity and was subject to contestation and revision. Now, the Manchus originated in these outer realms, but once they were ensconced in the Chinese capital, they, like the Mongols who'd conquered China before them, came to the conclusion, which was acquired in fact from Han Chinese political thought, that their rule consisted or constituted the center of a world order historically evolved hierarchy of civilization surrounded by variously ranked lower barbarian people. So we suggest in this lecture that these two very different long-standing and state-promoted understandings of political space are very much operative or in the background of operative in the present. And they obviously jar against each other and have consequences. And so since we're discussing regions in this conference, I'd like to give two examples to show how they've been important factors. First of all, in the very great practical difficulty of constructing regionalism in Northeast Asia. And secondly, in the impossibility for China and Russia to share even a limited space. So my first example concerns several attempts that were made to set up something called the Tumen River Project. And that was an idea which was based, in fact, on the idea of this kind of end of the Northeast Asia border as a multinational region. So it started in 1995 when China, Mongolia, Russia, North Korea, and South Korea signed an agreement to create a sort of economic development nexus named after the Tumen River, which forms the border between China and North Korea. And at some point, a series of discussions, and Japan was included too. And the key idea really was to build new infrastructure and open up one or more dedicated seaports on the North Korea coast. And the idea of that was that it would provide outlets for products from inland northeast China and Mongolia, and generally facilitate trade in the whole geographical vicinity. And that idea had a sort of Chinese ring to it, because China was very much behind it. And the idea was somehow that it would transcend its loss of a huge territory to Russia in the 19th century, which we mention again later. It would transcend that by cooperating with all its neighboring countries. And so it would create, through the good offices of the UNDP, a thriving port zone connected to development hubs in the various countries. And this would integrate a huge emergent region. Can I have the next slide, please? So you see there the Tumen River above and in blue, and below the green is the area they imagined would become this region. Anyway, the fact is this project failed, and instead it acted as a kind of micro-regional or sub-regional national focus for each country separately. And in fact, as a kind of intensifier for their disagreements and competing political ideologies. So ironically, it served to undermine regional integration. And to be specific, along with the mismatched political and economic interests, there was a divergence of conceptions of what region building should look like. So while China was the keenest to expand the grand regional idea, so as it were pushing out its defined outer realm of benevolent patronage, Japan was unwilling to commit funds and leadership to such an uncertain body. Japan also had an idea of a rather more distinct boundaries, while for Russia, with its concept of strict territorial sovereignty, the overlap implied by regionalism was anathema. For Russia, a share in an external project where it would not be the decisive body was not attractive. And in any case, it was determined to develop its own competing port, competing against these projected North Korean ones in Vladivostok. Now, I just want to mention now the second case I have in mind, which is about the non-shareability of territory. And this concerns the island in the Amur River that they divide between them. Next slide, please. Here you see the Amur River flowing around along the top part of the slide and going right around the edge of this island and coming back down towards the center. So in the 19th century, this entire island was under China, although it was inhabited only by a few indigenous people. However, at the point of Chinese weakness in 1929, the Soviets simply annexed it. Excuse me. And so they stationed troops there, and some civilian Russians too. But China never abandoned its claims. And at this point, both countries assumed that the border lay along the bank on the opposite side of its own. In other words, both Russia and China claimed the island. But the place seemed remote, and Chinese government didn't bother to push its claims. However, in the 1960s, relations between the two countries became antagonistic. There was a war in the 1960s, and the border was unsealed for 20 years. When relations improved under Gorbachev, it was decided to settle this dispute, and the two sides then agreed to abide by the international method of deciding riverine borders, which is not along either bank, but in the middle of the river along the line of the deepest channel. Now, in this case, the deepest channel ran close to the Russian bank. In other words, the upper level of the river you see on the slide, leaving the island entirely in Chinese hands. However, the Russian negotiators would not agree to this solution, and they insisted that half of the island should be left to them in order to form a buffer against possible attacks by Chinese for the city of Khabarovsk. And to avoid trouble, the Chinese agreed, and the island was divided in half, north to south. Could I have the next slide, please? So that bottom slide shows you where the island was divided. So it's worth considering, I think, the notion of a buffer zone. Internationally, it's held to be a neutral area serving to separate hostile forces or nations and prevent fighting. However, in Russian military thinking, the buffer is not neutral. It's our sovereign land, but it's held empty and inviolable as a kind of protective shield for a high-value object such as a city. So the Russian side of the island, the green part on the slide, became this kind of buffer. Now, as time went on, improvement in relations with China, the military base was closed down, soldiers moved away, and the collective farm that was on the island collapsed. But some people remained on the island amid the ruins, and they became really exemplary of the emptiness of the buffer. They were forgotten about, their state pleas for services were ignored. And this part of the island, if you go there now, became in effect a particularly benighted area of the closed zone that runs all along the border. And periodically, the bosses in Khabarovsk or somewhere up the hierarchy wake up to the possibilities of this island, and they take a decision to transform it. And they've had the amazing plans. It would be a tourist mecca, an ethnic museum. Another plan was a high-tech hub, an amusement park, and so forth. But each of these decisions, and these regional governors came and went, they're kind of characteristic of the decisionist landscape in Russia. But in this case, the decisionist landscape lost out to the buffer zone idea. The buffer came to prevail and all the alternatives came to nothing. And so the island, that's the Russian half of it, is still a place of absence and ruins. However, there's a different dictionary definition of the buffer zone, according to which it's a protected area, usually one designed for environmental protection, providing a natural habitat. Now, this second idea is the one that the Chinese took up for their half of the island. That's the part in pink in the lower part of the slide. They turned this into an environmental reserve, replete with birdwatching platforms, bans on vehicles, limited visitors, and designated walkways through the marshes. And recently, they've introduced Asian black bears, which are said to have a paradisical existence in the wilderness. So this idea of the buffer as an ecological zone chimed well, we think, with the Chinese spatial notion of the outermost concentric circle of the realm. So out there was pictured as far away from the Han Chinese core and urban life. It was the right place for wild creatures and maybe the odd person from a small, intrinsically non-civilized ethnic minority. Right now on this island, there's no crossing point between the Russian and the Chinese side, no road. So on the one side, there's the buffer as a cultivated wilderness, and on the other, the buffer as a military no man's land. Now, along with these two ideas of what the island is or is for, it has two different names. In Chinese, it's called Hexiaxi, and in Russian, Bolshoi Ussuriski. But please note, each country applies their name to the whole island and not just to their own side. Have the next slide, please. So this is a Russian map showing their vision of this island, which includes a nearby one called Tarabarov. The whole thing is got the Russian name. And could I have the next one? And this is a Chinese map showing the same thing. The Hexiaxis and the Chinese characters there, it also applies to the whole island. In other words, mentally, the Russianness of the island is extended beyond the actual border, and absolutely the same is true on the other side. And this leads to our next section of the talk.
So the examples we've provided so far show dramatically divergent spatial arrangements on either side of the border. We have also shown that the border constitutes a real fault line between Russia and China. And yet their space does not quite end at the border, in the sense that both countries have an aura that seeps beyond their boundaries. We define this auratic realm primarily as that which extends beyond the edges of the political states in ways that are not cartographically encoded. A space that is found beyond the boundaries of the state, but is suffused with national affect and which may at times become the subject of territorial disputes. So the term aura shares semantic resonance with soft power and with what some scholars have discussed under the term of atmosphere. But unlike atmospheres, which can be free floating and geographically unmoored, an aura remains tied to spatial reference, here the political state. It seems ethereal in that it is not made visible, it is never abstract or deterritorialized, but it remains anchored in the material realities of the state. At the same time, since they are not entangled in territorial disputes or claims of political sovereignty, auratic spaces are not bound to the legal and jurisdictional instruments that arbiter interstate competition. So aura is found at a productive intersection between the visible and the invisible, the material and the ethereal, the political and the imaginary. The geographies we qualify here as oratic thus supplement rather than challenge the state's territorial footprint in the sense that they operate within a different register. Like an object whose shape and size will change depending on the frequency at which it is observed, a focus on the oratic reveals the spectral qualities of the state, the ways in which soft power, infrastructure, or telecommunications radiate outwards, outside political boundaries. Through instruments other than sovereignty, these spaces beyond the borders interact with other states' spaces to create interferences, entanglements, and assemblages.
The idea of oratic space is conceptual and affectual. But before we discuss the theoretical implications further, I think it's important to record that it has some social implications on the ground. Or to put this differently, the ways in which imagination of seeping beyond or extension out there work in each country have real life effects and affects on the populations of the borderlands. This is clearest in the case of China, because its border regime, by which I mean its legal regulations for border residents and crossings, that regime emerges from the overall idea of Chinese society developed by the Communist Party. The vision is hierarchical, with a ranking of social categories that is made visible and actualized by these various differentiated legal requirements that in fact extend to subjects living beyond the Chinese border. Next slide, please. So this slide, which was constructed on the basis of these different legal requirements, shows how China imagines a social world of people that go beyond the border to this notion of these foreign wives and illegal immigrants. Essentially, the potential border crossers are categorized according to their perceived closeness or distance from the social core, which is the Chinese citizens of Han ethnicity. And the ranking, I think, in this border regime parallels the concentric spatial geographical mode discussed earlier. At the edge, in the policing of the borderlands, we see a graduated scale from generalized suspicion to selective criminalization. Now, China makes a radical distinction between the negative oratic effect of foreigners coming in to the country and the positive oratic effect of Chinese going out to conduct business with the world, which I'll now discuss, both of these aspects. The incomers are assiduously managed, and only those with specific visas are permitted into the core of China proper. So, for example, border dwellers who live on the Russian side of the border, they can enter China quite easily on temporary passes, but these passes allow them only into the border towns, and they are not allowed to penetrate deep inside China. Now, a few pockets of long-standing Russian origin refugees live in the Chinese borderlands, and these are peasant farmers who fled from the Bolshevik Revolution and civil war in the early 20th century. They fled into China, and they live on oratic or phantom, as we discussed later, lands in Manchuria that used to be dominated by Russian rule before the communists took over. However, with the communist victory, China absolutely took over this land, and the villagers, these Russian villagers, were rapidly assimilated through intermarriage and Chinese language education. Next slide, please. This is a photograph of an elder from one of these villages. Now, these days, these people hardly speak a word of Russian, and are counted as a variety of Chinese, as a minority, a sort of Chinese-Russian minority. And their remaining qualities of Russianness, for example, in their houses and food, has become a sort of exotic curiosity for Chinese tourists. Now, another interesting instance of auratic seepage is the strange Chinese legal category of foreign wives. Now, the existence of fairly large numbers of these foreign wives is explained by the gender imbalance in China, the preponderance of men over women. As it happens, on the Siberian border, Russia has the opposite gender imbalance from China, a dearth of marriageable men. So here on the border we're talking about, most foreign wives are Russians, and they have this kind of auratic quality of being Russian or having been Russian, but now dislocated into Chinese wifedom. Now, recent research shows that it's very difficult to, or bureaucratically difficult to legalize these marriages in China. And in any case, the men involved may prefer a temporary or informal union. And so what that means in this regime is that the foreign wives, so-called, can shade into the category of illegal immigrants. And in Southwest China, the discourse of foreign wives is also highly racialized. So many ethnic minority women are repatriated as illegals, whether they're properly married or in their view properly married or not. But along the northeast border we're considering, the category is also racialized, but in a different way, with the European aura of these wives being much prized. Next slide, please. This is a Chinese ad for what a good idea it is to get married to a Russian wife. So the Russian wife is a highly valued category in Chinese male discourse, notionally blonde, beautiful, civilized, and because it sort of hangs there as a sort of model, any Russian wife is a catch, whatever she happens to look like. In this case, the incoming Russians, or Russianness, is again incorporated into the Chinese body politic and imagined to enhance its human quality. However, meanwhile, the women themselves can suffer if they are unable to adapt to Chinese family life. So what's absorbed is their biopolitical high quality. It's absorbed into the Chinese nation in the person of their children, who become Chinese citizens at birth, but they're not permitted to take Russian citizenship. If there's a divorce, the mother can go home, but the children have to stay. They have to stay in China. So we have here this construction of a graduated citizenship in which foreign wives are a lowly and vulnerable category, combined with the overall pattern of either swallowing people up, like the refugees, or extrusion of foreigners. Either way, whether people are swallowed up or forced out, this is not conducive to the emergence of an egalitarian regional identity. As for the Chinese locals going out now, outwards, such as traders who go to work in Russia with Russian customers, they have a legal status border dweller, which has the advantage of giving them easier border crossing to Russia. But on the other hand, it also makes them subject to increased surveillance and relentless educational and ideological campaigns, since the idea is that they should uphold Chinese greatness and civilization in their interactions with the other. They are instructed to project China's aura in the foreign land. However, as you may imagine, this is not always well received in Russia, where it comes to face to face with Russia's own long-standing idea of its greatness and civilizational superiority. Turning now briefly to Russia's social border management, the setup is very different from the Chinese. but no less antithetical to regionalism. Instead of carefully graded social categories and legal requirements, there's a kind of jumble of miscellaneous people in the Russian Far East, some of them being old settlers, but most being recent arrivals from all over the former Soviet Union. And in this case, it's more their turbulent history that animates these people and colors the aura that they perceive emanating from former Russian people and places in China. So those very same pockets of old villager emigres, which I mentioned earlier and I showed you the slide of the old man, those people are seen by many Russians not as touristic curiosities, but as living remnants of ancestral disloyalty. Even today, they are still attached emotionally to this history. They're condemned for having fled from Russia and its revolution, for collaborating with enemies, for not maintaining Russia's aura in full, and for submitting to alien Chineseness.
Some of the auratic spaces we've discussed so far in this talk include buffer zones, liminal zones, often found across the domestic and the international. Historically, if one looks at a textbook example, there will be Afghanistan, for instance, or zones of conflict, where time is always inscribed in buffers. They are never meant to last, only to ease transition to a jigsaw-like political cartography. They are thus transitional objects, spatially, but also temporally, insofar as they stabilize momentarily a political geography that is in flux, dynamic, and responsive. As the work of our colleague Natasha Ryzhova has shown, during the Soviet period, Russia was home to dozens, possibly hundreds, of so-called closed spaces, ranging from border exclusion zones to villages, sometimes entire cities, with links to the military-industrial complex, like the port city of Vladivostok, for example. In the many spaces of exclusion that still remain in contemporary Russia, notably villages and settlements on the Russia-China border, restrictions continue to apply to both foreigners and non-resident Russians. For people residing in these exclusion zones, it can feel like being utterly cut off from the world. Visits from outsiders are restricted and regulated, thus making it virtually impossible to open a business, for example. But being a resident in a restricted zone also confers special status from which to derive pride, membership in a special entity in an otherwise homogeneous national space. As a point of contact between states, international borders are where state theater is most strongly shown. The edge of the state stands as a metonym for the nation overall. It guarantees the integrity of the national identity that separates self from other. To quote former President Trump, a country without borders is not a country at all. And in fact, we see this fetishistic treatment of borders as not something unique to Russia. The management of the US border zones shares striking similarities. Next slide, please. So while it's not demarcated as strictly as the Russian border, it extends 100 miles inland, and it completely encloses a number of states such as Florida or New York, as well as substantial portions of the most densely populated states like California. In fact, 9 of the 10 largest US metropolitan areas fall within this area. Within the border zones, federal regulations give US Customs and Border Protection extended authority to conduct random and arbitrary stops and searches over, in effect, roughly 2/3 of the United States population. So what these examples suggest is that even in contemporary political cartography, frontiers have not been completely replaced by borders. The state outlines we are so familiar with are supplemented by zones of varying depth that do not appear on maps, forms of sovereignty that do not dovetail with the official outline of the state. Another example of territorial aura is the one that extends from the coastline, where the concept of territorial waters has been in existence since the late 18th century. Since 1994, the United National Convention of the Law of the Sea grants coastal states additional sovereign rights over extended continental shelves up to 350 nautical miles from the coastal baseline. So it really shows kind of a mismatch between the outline of the state and the reality of it. But what is perhaps more worthy of attention here is the effective investment of states in regions and countries found outside their borders, in what I've called in previous articles, phantom space. And it's also what we commonly refer to as their backyard, or in the case of Russia, the near abroad. And two particular forms of erratic space. These are two particular forms of erratic space that are highly relevant for the current events in Ukraine. Phantom spaces are, in a nutshell, territories that were but are no longer part of the national formation. So this new political and topographic reality is consciously understood and generally not contested. However, on an emotional level, they remain attached to the national body. They are no longer within the nation, but they have not quite become foreign either. With time, these territorial attachments fade away and earlier footprints, state footprints eventually fall into oblivion. But some prove to be particularly resistant to remapping. So Northeast Asia, and particularly the vast region bisected by the Sino-Russian international boundary, is such a place. The construction of the Chinese Eastern Railway at the turn of the 20th century, a Russian-owned enterprise that linked Chita to Vladivostok, brought a large contingent of Russians to the region and led to the founding of Harbin and other cities. And Harbin was essentially a Russian city within Chinese territory. For several decades, Harbin remained very Russian, spatially and culturally organized around the Saint Sophia Cathedral, one of the largest Christian churches in Asia. Harbin grew significantly after the Bolshevik Revolution to eventually become the largest European population center outside of the state of Russia. The streets of Harbin were lined with European-style buildings, and the city was known as the Paris of the East on account of its Russian European presence and rich cultural life. But in the 1930s, following the Japanese occupation of Manchuria, most Russians left the city, some for the Soviet Union, others for other cities in China, and eventually abroad. By the early 1960s, only a handful of Europeans still remained, most of them elderly. And yet, when we talk to people, the Russian borderlanders about Harbin, it was always described to us as Russian. Irrespective of the age of the interviewee, the impression generally conveyed was that Harbin had somehow remained part of the Russian cultural topography, a place where many local residents have Russian ancestry and speak Russian. In fact, those few Harbin residents who speak Russian are generally interpreters or tour guides. Harbin is not claimed by Russians as theirs, yet it remains a space that feels somehow familiar with the ghostly Russian past that continues to endure. Chinese residents of Harbin, by contrast, do not feel particularly Russian. Harbin is in fact a quintessentially Chinese place, known in China as the city with the purest unaccented Mandarin. Fascinatingly, for the Chinese, vast tracts of the Russian Far East are associated with a previously wider national map that included Mongolia, Tuva, and in some historical interpretations, even extended as far as the Arctic Ocean. Like in the case of Harbin, these sentiments find expression outside of the official realm, in private conversations or internet forums. And you can see on this slide the phantom territories I'm talking about. And what is particularly interesting about these Russian and Chinese territorial phantoms is that they are organized differently spatially. Russian phantoms are nodular, the cities of Harbin, Dalian, and Port Arthur, which are former sites of articulation of the Chinese Eastern Railway. By contrast, the Chinese territorial phantoms are organized concentrically, expanding outwards and lacking a well-defined limit or outline. For some, this former footprint extends to the territories formerly controlled during the Qing dynasty. For others, it extends much farther potentially encompassing the whole of Siberia. So the many examples offered so far in the discussion point to a misalignment between, on the one hand, an unambiguous cartography with established and recognized borders, and Russia and China came to a resolution of their disputed borders in 2008. And on the other hand, there is an erratic space that obeys different spatial rules altogether. And these effective spaces constitute less a space separating two entities than a space joining them, overlapping space, which leads to productive assemblages that challenge the very ideal of the state as discrete and autonomous. And here we can think back again about the divided island Caroline discussed, with a Russian and Chinese name, and imagine entire and undivided by both sides. Similarly, the largely under-theorized political concept of backyard, which we want to unpack in this next section, speaks to entanglements and overlaps that resemble pre-Westphalian political geographies, and that evoke the tension between the apparent stable boundaries of the state and its much more ambiguous incarnation. It allows for a view of the state that is both unconfined to its physical boundaries and that melts into its contiguous neighbors. What the notions of buffer, backyard, and the erratic speak to an excess of sovereignty for what is of the state, yet is not contained in the state. And we suggest that the notion of backyard, and what we have glossed here as phantom territories in particular, can be very useful to track geopolitical shifts, such as Russia's war in Ukraine or China's intention in Taiwan. As a space that is outside a house, yet still within the realm of the domestic, the backyard is a useful metaphor of liminality and buffering. So in its primary context of home ownership, a backyard refers to the space beyond the prying eyes of neighbors, a space which the Californian city of Fremont has glossed as typically private and more personalized, designed for privacy from neighbors. That the concept should have been taken up in geopolitics to designate spaces beyond the state's sovereign reach, instead of a less loaded term such as neighborhood, for instance, is really noteworthy. It appropriates those extraterritorial spaces into the realm of the domestic, and thus directly running counter to the cartographic practices that are characteristic of the post-Westphalian political order. The dimension of ownership present in the original context also deserves notice in that it endures in the selective mobilization of the term. So we use the term backyard for world powers such as the United States, Russia, or the European Union. But speaking of a backyard in the context of a small country like Estonia would sound absurd. Similarly, the area designed as backyard tends to denote a state comparatively weaker. So in the context of the United States, they would clearly refer to the unequal relations with Central and South America rather than Canada. For Russia, similarly, Ukraine may qualify as a backyard, while China would not. So in geopolitics, this usage of the concept of backyard to refer to a neighboring area where a state is invested and within which actions by enemy or competing powers may be feared is really interesting. The term is really potent today, and particularly now in the context of Russia and NATO. During the Cold War, the notion was mostly used in reference to Cuba, whose close proximity to Florida was perceived as an existential threat. The next slide.
So I'll just note that we're at the hour now. So if the speakers could fairly soon wind up, then we'll have some chance for Q&A.
Okay, I'll try and wrap up quickly. So these geopolitical anxieties are not, of course, just tied to the deployment. They were not just tied to the deployment of Soviet ballistic missiles. They were also tied to the sense that the territory, the sovereign territory was being impinged upon, and this erratic space in particular was being impinged upon. So while it's not exactly equivalent, the Russian concept of the near abroad, ближнее зарубежье, covers similar semantic ground as the US backyard. So I don't really have time to get into that, but I would refer you to the wonderful work of Gerard Toll, who wrote a wonderful book called Near Abroad. So the fact that Russia is a successor state of a larger entity in places. Sorry, I'm just trying to remove a bit, and it's becoming difficult. So three decades after the breakup of the Soviet Union, it remains common in Russia to hear, like even in official meetings, Russians referring to Ukraine with terms such as our Ukraine, Nasha Ukraina, and that was before the attack last month. Ukraine, like Belarus, and to a lesser extent the other former republics, constitute in a sense phantom territories. They are outside the nation, but they remain somehow attached to the national body on an emotional level. They are no longer within the nation, but they have not become quite foreign either. And this form of affects rely on the soft power that a state is capable to exert. The choice of the term aura seeks to reflect this idea of something that radiates outwards, a force that exudes and seeps beyond the defined political borders of a political entity. And maybe I will leave Caroline to say a few words in conclusion. Caroline, if you would just want to.
Yes, well, as soon as the war on Ukraine began, political scientists began wondering whether the events might prompt China to follow suit and carry out a similar attack on Taiwan. And although we don't intend to make any forecasts about the future in this very evolving situation, it's certainly true that the Chinese Twitter sphere appears to be largely supportive of Putin's war. And I think it's also difficult not to see, however, the immediate similarities in terms of the relationship between a large state viewing a smaller state as a fragment that needs to be reintegrated. Neither Russia nor China see Ukraine and Taiwan respectively as genuinely sovereign nations, but as, in fact, phantom territories. I'm just very briefly going to wrap up now. We began this lecture about the hard and inflexible border that separates Russia from China. We described how these two are very different states with little or no cultural overlap and with no disputed borders right now. Yet a focus on the umbrella term auratic and on its variants, we've talked about backyards, buffers, and phantoms, brings to light something very important: how territorial sovereignty is never fully extensive, coextensive with the Westphalian political geography that we're accustomed to. There are always liminal spaces lining the border. And we can think of Russia's exclusion zone, spaces that encroach on others, as well as spectral spaces that partially overlap. We suggest that the mobilization of these concepts can be fruitful for the literature on regions, particularly for world areas like Northeast Asia, which have traditionally been studied piecemeal from different regional perspectives. And we'll end it there.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this really fascinating set of both empirical and conceptual insights. I have to say there's a bit of special resonance for me. Unusually, when I was a boy of 14 in the summer of 1969, my parents took me and my two siblings on a chunk of the Trans-Siberian Railroad, starting off, well, not in Vladivostok, because it was, as Frank points out, a space of exclusion, but from Nahodka up to Khabarovsk. And I still remember this was a time of great tension along the Amur River with the border. So this concept of a linear decisionist perspective that we outlined in the beginning was very much evident, as my father almost lost his camera because he was taking a picture at one point outside looking towards the border. So I have this kind of personal resonance with the background of what you're talking about. And of course, it's fascinating to sort of see some of the insights you bring to bear on what's happened since then, both in this space that you're looking at, and also some conceptual ideas about how to look at things. So we will now have some opportunity for questions and comments. As Katerina already put in the chat, if you have a question, you can either raise your hand that I'll try to identify you, or you can put a question in the chat. We already have one in the chat, and for purposes of the recording, I will restate the questions that are in the chat so that they're there in the recording. But the first question is from John Harrison. He says, I was fascinated by the US 100-mile border zone fact, 2/3 of the population living in it. My question is how much this is a genuine border consequence. The map suggested the land borders between US and Canada/Mexico are much less populated than the eastern and western coastal borders. The latter obviously raises border questions, but the link between borders and population is different to a land border. Russia-China is a land border, so I'm interested in how you see the border/population comparison working.
So this example I was providing was really to show that the Russia situation is far from unique, that borders are always very sensitive spaces. I wouldn't want to go too explicitly and in kind of making comparison between the US situation and the Russian states. This point was really to show the kind of fetishistic approach to borders we have. That even in a place like the US, this border, which is true, completely different from, between Canada and Mexico, the different populations, different threats. There's still the sense that this border needs to be lined in a kind of a homogeneous way, and it really kind of shows a gap between the core and the outside, the border. So that's the only thing I was trying to show in this particular image. And you can, I mean, in different contexts, you would have different ways to manage borders, but it's still a very, it's always a site that is, it's a special place. It's not just kind of the same as the rest of the country.
Thank you. Maybe I could use the chair's privilege to ask a question. Maybe I'll direct this one to Caroline. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the indigenous people of the borderland and how they've come to imagine an alternative spatiality to that of the Chinese and the Russians. I mean, how that relates to questions of imperialism and colonialism in the region.
Thank you. That's a very important, quite difficult question to answer, because the indigenous people along this border, they range from really tiny little groups of reindeer herders and hunters to very large populations of hundreds of thousands of people who are much more securely settled with cities and a long cultural history. And what we discovered was that, of course, on both sides of the border, all of these people have been subject to colonialism and imperialism, although they're all hesitant to use those words because they know that they don't go down well in Russia or China, who like to think that all these people sort of voluntarily sort of found themselves as citizens of the two respective countries. But it's quite clear, I think, objectively from the outside, there were processes of colonization. People were moved, Russians were moved into the Far East, and Chinese people were moved up to the border, and that displaced a lot of these people. And the reactions of the indigenous people have been a bit varied, because in the small groups, I think they've really been so hammered by this colonial policy and the fact that they're sort of squeezed out into the most marginal land, particularly in Russia. They're sort of living hand to mouth, basically. They have no energy for anything else. But some of these larger groups turn to history. As I mentioned earlier in the talk, history is very important in this whole borderland, and these larger groups remember they're mostly of Mongolian descent and Mongolian language group, and they remember, of course, the centuries ago when the Mongolians were ruling this whole region, and they delight in getting together or remembering genealogies that take them back to those great rulers of the past. And on that basis, they gather together huge numbers of people and do meet up. So we have these informal gatherings of people across the border among those groups, but not the smaller ones.
Great, thanks so much. We have another question in the chat from Sally Hardy. I'll read it. Borders have been an area of study for regional scholars for many years. RSA has hosted many sessions on borders within the EU in particular. What does your research say about how borders in general can be managed to mutual benefit, and what the red flags are for the future?
That's a really difficult question. You say that again? what can our work do?
Right. It's really a question about if they're to ask you to generalize a little bit about how borders in general can be managed to the mutual benefit of, well, all parties involved, I guess, and what red flags your work suggests we should be particularly concerned about for the future. I mean, I actually might cast that question in relation to something I've been thinking about a little bit. You know, there's a big literature, particularly in political science, on, you know, the catalysts that make some border disputes much hotter than others. And I think maybe the question is trying to get a little bit at that. Are there insights that you have gained that might give you some sense of things that maybe the political scientists aren't necessarily always looking at that would help to explain why some borders are much more kind of zones of hot dispute than others?
Yeah, I feel that borders are still imagined a very, very Darwinian way. You know, like there's this really one or the other. It's by mutual exclusion. Whatever you gain is to the loss of somebody else. I think these metaphors that we have of competition. You mentioned earlier this book I'm finishing on the conceptual link between states and bodies. Previously, we used to the general kind of the metaphor for evolution was very Darwinian. It was, you know, competition between different types of bodies. There's much more work now being done on collaboration, on looking at hybrid forms, looking at how bodies, organisms collaborate with each other. So maybe that would be a better metaphor, maybe. And maybe the European Union has been, could be an example in that sense, within the European Union, at least, not the border of the European Union itself, but how states can have their own identity, but still collaborate with each other. So maybe this sense of collaboration, but that's the hope. But then you see what's happening with Russia and Ukraine is still a very very old style kind of thoughts about geopolitics. There's no sense of overlap there. It's just either or. So I don't know. It's just, yeah.
And I think it's very important to have some kind of apparatus of trust, some set of maybe agreed upon principles or institutions that both sides trust, which is really absent on our border. So this is why Franck and I are rather finding it difficult to discuss it. For example, there's no bridge over the border rivers. And when COVID started in China, Russia immediately shut the door on the border crossings. And right now, with China's sort of blanket keep out COVID at any cost, its border with Russia is completely closed. There are no flights, there are nothing. You can't get in there. And this, of course, you know, for all the talk of lovely strategic partnership, on the ground, it only fosters more mistrust, I think, in both countries. So it's having measures that somehow can bridge that sort of impasse, I think, is the most important thing.
Yeah, and I think the fact that our borders is so different from many borders because of the historical situation and the evolution that we discussed at the beginning, it also makes it difficult for us to generalize on borders overall, because it's an outlying case, the Russia-China border in many ways.
But it is, I mean, the whole discussion really, and even the challenge of addressing a question like this really is a sort of dramatic illustration of the tension that exists between the kind of structural rigidities of the way we kind of usually think about how space is organized, and these kind of underlying realities that you've used a variety of terms to try to refer to. I really find this concept of the auratic really quite interesting, and of course, there's a lot of recent border literature that's done a lot to explore the kind of resistant fiction that political borders and territorial sovereignty are coextensive. And of course, all states are always more than their cartographic footprint. There are free trade zones and military bases and refugee processing centers and all sorts of things. But it'd be interesting just against that backdrop to hear you just say a little bit more about what you think auratic brings to the, brings to the fore, and how we can use that concept going forward.
Yeah, it's true. There's a lot of there's definitely a misalignment between the political borders and the way territorial sovereignty actually operates. And yeah, I mean, there's in both geography, anthropology, there's been so much work, so many new terms kind of coined, such as flexible sovereignty and unbundled, graduated, variegated, just to try to come to grasp with that gap, this misalignment. But I think by using these kind of hyphenated terms, we're kind of describes them in some way as zones of exceptions within. There's still the sense that there is such a thing as the Westphalian model. We're trying to add additional adjectives to sort of qualify that, but still work within the system. I think the aura is different in the sense that it recognizes the state as something that always seeps beyond. It's not an exception, but it's really kind of a part of the way the state functions. So there is this territorial ambivalence. It doesn't exist in spite of the state, but it's really kind of folded within it structurally. But there is also some kind of there are some similarities between the two, because I think when we think about this military bases and free trade zone and all that, there's a differential in terms of power differential. So which states can afford to do that? You can have border management zones for the United States outside of the United States, but you could not imagine having Mexican similar structures within the United States. There's really kind of a power who can afford to go beyond its own borders, who can afford to do that. And in the same way, the auratic is also depends on the size of the state as well. The bigger, the stronger the state, the more of an aura it exudes. So I think there are similarities there, but it's really, I think the difference would be try not to see this misalignment as a situation of exception, but really as something that we have to come to grasp with.
It would be interesting, kind of hearkening back a little bit to Sally Hardy's question, but turning it around, sort of think about, there are cases where relatively hot border disputes have actually been more or less settled over the last several decades. Yes. And that would be a kind of opposite way to sort of think about this, where there are aspects of the auras surrounding those borders, like Ecuador, Peru, for example. That was a really hot dispute 40 years ago or so, but now is pretty as far as I know, is pretty much settled. Were there aspects of that aura that made that maybe a little bit more amenable to settlement than in other cases?
Yeah, and then the other way around as well. Some disputes you think were settled and then they erupt suddenly. Yeah, it's really interesting, and I think I'm always, I mean, as an anthropologist, I'm always kind of wary of just looking at border dispute as something that is, from the top down. There's so much engagement, visceral engagement, at personal level, and that is sometimes kind to control. I think in the case of China, there's a lot of the Chinese stratosphere is exploding with, kind of nationalistic claims that the state itself might not be very comfortable with. Like also when the border between Russia and China was settled, they had to do it in a kind of private kind of a hidden way, because there was a lot of reaction from Russians and Chinese who were very unhappy about that resolution. The Russian thought the Chinese had taken too much. The Chinese thought, well, if we agree to have this border settled, then maybe we kind of revisit it later. So the two states, it was in the benefit of the two states to do something about this border and to quiet down the dispute. But there's a lot of emotion behind it. So I think that's the difficulty. It's like to recognize that it's not just a top-down discourse. There's also a visceral reaction and affect towards borders. So maybe that's why it's so difficult to predict.
Right. So I think we might have one more question here. We're getting somewhat tight on time, but we've still got a little time. This is from Aliu Kawu. In weak states or nations, border communities are known to come together to strengthen economic ties. But the red flag of this interaction is when the states become weaker, these areas become more affected. This is presently manifested itself between Nigeria and Niger, where Boko Haram insurgents have intensified cross-border crime. So maybe that's less of a question than a comment, but it's an interesting observation related to what we were just talking about. Caroline, if somebody said, oh, COVID goes away, you can have 9 months to spend back somewhere doing something back in this border region, this border zone you've looked at, what would you do? How would you spend your time? What's the next thing you'd really like to look at to try to sort of even further deepen this fascinating set of insights you've offered us?
Well, I think I would be very interested in going to do some field work and investigating further these cross-border links, which are sort of, in terms of kinship mainly, that's the way people talk about it, about distant cousins. And somebody said to me the other day, oh, a close cousin of mine said something or other, this person's cousin was in the army fighting. This was a person from this region sent to fight in the Russian army in Ukraine. And I just inquired sort of more or less randomly close. I said, how close is that? And he said, well, it's only a third or fourth cousin. And I said, well, that's distant by our imagination. He said, not for us. They have these vast ramifying sort of kinship networks. And I'm just really interested in how and why that happens and how they're used and how they creep across the border to generations separated by, centuries maybe, and to create a set of relations that is just utterly separate from either the Russian or the Chinese state.
Yeah. How about you, Franck?
I'd be interested to go to, I'm not sure where I would go. I'd like to go to both Russia and China to get a sense of how people are responding to current events beyond the media. So there's, what we hear from Russia, of course, is very controlled, and China as well. So it'd be very interested to see what people on the ground think about the events and try to gauge the the evolution in terms of geopolitical orientations for both countries. But yeah, I'd be kind of, I'm not sure I'd like to go, to be honest, because I don't think it's very safe.
Right. So I see in the chat that there is an attendee who is writing a question right now. So we'll just wait for that question to come through. We are getting close to the end of the session. Let me just say a couple of logistical things before we get that question and wind it up. But first of all, just a great thanks to Franck and Caroline for their presentations. The session is recorded and it's going to be soon available on the RSA hub. So if you want to follow up on any details you missed, you can catch that on the RSA hub. You also should know that a networking space will be open right after the plenary. So that's available to you. And then, of course, next up on the program are parallel sessions, actually tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. GMT, which sadly is 1 in the morning, Frank's and my time. But you can view all the sessions on the RSA hub. So let's see, we have one last comment here in Adorno's discourse on erratic and Walter Benjamin's on technological reproductivity. Can everyday lifestyle bring regions together? I wonder if either of you would like to address that.
2 minutes.
Well, 3.
3 minutes. I think that's the hope, right? It's just what we're trying to, I mean, that's how we started this project. We wanted to see what was happening at the border. We hear all these kind of big statements from Russia and China about partnerships, and we wanted to see what was on the ground. What we found is 2 very, very different groups, but, you know, going forward, it is possible that it would be maybe more interaction between the 2 and better, but it's difficult to, we don't want to predict the future. If the person who posed the question wants to reach out to me, I'm happy to discuss further. I think we have very little time now, but I've seen these kind of movements in the context of Mongolia and China. Yes, there's through interaction things, there's an evolution.
We also got one last one, maybe quickly, a question from Dmitry Korpakis. Could the presence or absence of cities close to borders indicate temperature across them? I don't know if either one of you want to say anything about that.
Well, we have a lot in our book. We have a lot about cities in our book. Yeah, so I would, yeah, without trying to advertise the book, I would just, if that's something.
Yes, there are a range of a number of, along the border, several places where there's a Russian city on one side and a Chinese one on the other side. And the relations between them are quite varied, I would think. And one where I worked, which is Manjuli on the Chinese side, is a huge bustling Chinese city. And on the other side, the Chinese Zabaikalsk is a really sleepy, sort of somnolent Russian place, which is just really crisscrossed by trains. But in other cases, it is rather different. And I think that, yes, I think that Heike and Bhagavatians, people are trading a lot, aren't they? And I could imagine that some development would take place there with people in Russia learning Chinese and Chinese people being eager to go to the city across the water to do business. In a limited way, I think, yes, there could be some improvement.
Well, and again, it may be one of those things where place matters. So, very much would depend on, nature and kind of cities and so forth from place to place. Well, we are at time. Please join me in thanking profoundly Franck and Caroline for the fascinating insights they brought to bear today. Usual clapping. And just again, if you look in the chat, Katerina has put a link there where you can get to this networking space that will be available And again, a recording of this will be available on the hub, if on the RSA hub. Thank you so much to our speakers. Thank you to all of you who joined, and I wish you a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you, Alec.
Thank you, Alec.
Excellent.
Yep.
My pleasure.